Prairie Bend, Kansas, 1889. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a woman homesteading alone. Not the quiet of peace exactly, but the quiet of constant vigilance, of a mind that never fully rests because every fence and every hinge and every loose board is entirely her own responsibility to notice and fix. Temperance Wilcox, who had gone by Tempe since childhood and answered to nothing else, had lived inside that particular quiet for the better part of a year, having come to Prairie Bend from Ohio after her husband's sudden death left her with a small inheritance, a stubborn independent streak, and a firm private conviction that she would rather homestead alone on her own 160 acres than return to Ohio and become some relative's grateful permanent house guest. She was 25 years old, capable and quick. With light red hair she kept braided tight for the work, and a light blue dress she had long since accepted would never again look entirely clean. And she managed her small spread with a determined competence that had, over her first year, earned her the cautious respect of a town initially skeptical of a woman farming alone. Elias Corbin was the town's wheelwright, the man responsible for keeping nearly every wagon and cart in 3 counties properly rolling. And he lived on the property adjoining Tempe's own, a fact she had noted with mild interest her first week in Prairie Bend, and then largely stopped thinking about, absorbed as she was in the endless demands of her own new land. He was 58 years old, broad through the shoulders and thick in the forearms from decades of shaping wood and iron, his hair gone fully gray now, his beard kept short and practical, his hands permanently marked with the small nicks and calluses of his trade. He had been widowed 11 years, his wife Agnes taken by a lung fever that had moved through Prairie Bend hard one particular winter. And in the 11 years since, he had settled into a solitary, largely silent existence, respected throughout the county for the quality of his work, but generally regarded as a man who preferred his own company to most conversation. His days ran as steady and unremarkable as the wagon wheels he built. His shop opened before most of Prairie Bend had properly woken, closed only once the light gave out, his evenings spent alone over a plain supper. He rarely troubled himself to properly cook. I did not know much about Elias Corbin that first year beyond his reputation for good, honest work and his general disinclination toward neighborly chatter. And I suspect he knew equally little about me beyond the fact that a young widow had taken up the adjoining property and seemed, by all outward evidence, entirely too stubborn to ask for help she plainly needed. Prairie Bend sat along a shallow bend of a creek that mostly ran dry by August. A modest farming community with a mercantile, a church, a small schoolhouse, and Elias's wheelwright shop standing at the crossroads where the county road met the trail out to the homesteads. The town had watched my arrival the previous year with a particular mixture of curiosity and quiet doubt. Small towns generally reserve for any woman attempting to manage land on her own, several of the older farming wives predicting, not unkindly but not quietly either, that I would abandon the effort by the following spring. I had spent that first year determined to prove them wrong through sheer stubborn labor, plowing and planting and mending what I could myself, and largely succeeding, though the effort left precious little time or energy for anything resembling a social life, mine own included. My days ran from well before dawn until well past dusk, chores and repairs and the endless small maintenance of a homestead built entirely by one pair of hands, and I had grown, without quite intending to, into the particular kind of tiredness that leaves little room for noticing much beyond the next day's necessary labor. Elias's late wife, Agnes, had apparently told him once, back in years he rarely spoke of, that a man who noticed what needed fixing before being asked was worth considerably more than one who waited politely to be told, and that the noticing itself was its own particular form of love, quieter than words, but no less real for the quiet of it. I learned this only much later, secondhand, but looking back on that whole strange, wonderful year, I believe he must have carried that instruction with him every single day since her passing, even through 11 years of largely keeping to himself. It was late that October, with the first hard frost already threatening, and my own gate hanging crooked on a hinge. I had been meaning to repair for the better part of 2 months, without ever quite finding the daylight hours to spare for it. that I woke one morning to find the whole gate not merely repaired, but entirely rebuilt. A new hinge set true. The wood itself reinforced where the old post had begun to rot, the work done sometime in the deep dark hours before dawn, no note left, no bill presented, simply the plain fact of a properly working gate where a crooked, half-broken one had stood the evening before. I stood at that gate a long while that morning, turning the whole strange courtesy over in my mind, and though nobody had signed the work, the quality of it told its own story clearly enough. A wheelwright's careful, exact craftsmanship unmistakable to anyone who had spent even a season watching Elias Corbin work. I walked over to his shop that same afternoon, still uncertain exactly what I meant to say, and found him bent over a wagon wheel with the particular stillness of a man entirely absorbed in careful work. "Mr. Corbin," I said, "my gate was crooked yesterday evening and rebuilt entirely by this morning, and I have a fair idea whose hands did it." He set down his tools and looked at me, a faint, unreadable expression crossing his weathered face. "Gate looked like it was fixing to come off its post entirely," he said, by way of explanation. "Seemed a foolish thing to let a woman deal with a falling gate in November weather when I had the lumber and the hour to spare before my own shop opened." "You did not have to do that," I said, which felt, even as I said it, like an inadequate response to the plain generosity of the gesture. "I know," he said, and there was something dry and unhurried in the way he said it, a small crack of humor I had not expected from a man of his reputation. "Don't thank a man twice your age for doing what any decent neighbor would have done regardless." I laughed, surprised by it, and told him plainly that I intended to thank him anyway, decent neighbor or not, and he almost smiled at that, an expression that seemed to catch him nearly as off guard as it caught me. That should have been the whole of it. A kind neighbor quietly fixing a gate and receiving belated thanks for it, the kind of small mercy any decent person in Prairie Bend might extend to a struggling neighbor. Except that the gate turned out to be merely the first of what became, over the following weeks, a whole quiet pattern of similar unannounced repairs, each one appearing overnight or during the brief hours I happened to be away at the mercantile, never once with Elias present to witness my discovery of them or claim any credit for the work. I found my chicken coop's loose boards reinforced one week, the roof's worst leak patched the next, my own tool shed's sagging door re-hung true the week after that, and by the third such discovery, I had stopped being merely grateful and started, somewhat helplessly, watching for him, noting the particular hours his shop light stayed lit late into the evening, wondering how many of those late hours were spent on paying wheelwright work and how many on quietly maintaining a young widow's struggling homestead. It was in November that I mentioned to Mrs. Pruitt at the mercantile, not intending the remark to travel any further, that my well pump had grown so stiff I could barely work it some mornings, my own strength simply insufficient against a mechanism built for larger hands. Elias, hearing of it within the week the way most things eventually reached him in a town this size, appeared at my well one Saturday afternoon without announcement, disassembled the whole pump mechanism on my kitchen table, and spent the better part of 3 hours refitting and re-greasing every working part until the handle moved under my own hand with barely any effort at all, gone again, before I had properly finished thanking him for it. "You did not have to do that," I told him again, standing in his shop doorway the following week, my hands still smelling of the well pump's fresh grease. "I know," he said, exactly as he had before, and I began to understand, slowly, that this particular exchange, "You did not have to, and I know," had become something between us, a small ritual neither of us had quite planned, but neither of us seemed inclined to abandon either. By December, I had lost count of exactly how many small repairs had passed silently between us, each one arriving without ceremony, each one answered eventually with the same quiet acknowledgement, until the whole pattern had become as familiar to me as my own morning chores. I began, in turn, noticing small gaps in Elias's own domestic arrangements, a man living alone who ate poorly and irregularly by his own admission, more interested in getting back to his shop than in properly feeding himself. And I started leaving a portion of whatever supper I had cooked on his porch most evenings, never announced, never billed, simply left where his hands would find it when his own long day finally ended. "I know," he said, the first time he mentioned it, echoing my own words back at me with that same small, dry humor. Seemed a foolish thing to let good cooking go to waste when a man had a porch and an appetite both. He kept an old barn cat, more feral than tame, that had never once permitted any human closer than an arm's length in the whole of Elias's ownership. And yet the creature took, within weeks of my supper deliveries beginning, to appearing on my own porch most evenings, winding briefly around my ankles before disappearing back toward Elias's property, as though the animal itself had appointed himself a small, silent messenger between our two households. The town noticed, the way small towns invariably notice everything eventually. Mrs. Hattie Pruitt, who ran the mercantile, remarked to her husband that Elias Corbin had been buying an odd assortment of lumber and hardware that made little sense for paying wheelwright work, mostly hinges and fence wire and roofing nails, unless one considered that a struggling young homesteader next door might have use for exactly such things. And old Ambrose Grubb, who ran the livery, observed that my own account at the mercantile had grown considerably lighter than a woman managing land alone generally required, as though someone else's careful provision had begun quietly supplementing my own. I told myself I was simply the fortunate beneficiary of an unusually decent neighbor, the plain good fortune of having settled beside a man whose whole character ran toward quiet, practical generosity. Elias, I later learned, told himself he was merely being neighborly, the sensible, practical duty any capable man owed a widow struggling to manage land alone. Neither explanation held up especially well under close examination, though at the time, neither of us examined it too closely, because the examining threatened to surface something both of us had reasons to leave carefully alone. My own fear, when I finally sat with it honestly one evening by my own small fire, wore a shape I recognized immediately, having carried some version of it since my husband's death. I was 25 years old and had come to Kansas specifically to prove, to myself as much as to anyone watching, that I required nobody's rescue, that a woman alone could manage perfectly well through her own stubborn effort, and to let myself depend on Elias Corbin's quiet generosity, however freely given, felt uncomfortably close to admitting the very failure I had crossed half a country to avoid proving true. I told myself, therefore, that what I felt toward him was simple, grateful friendship between capable neighbors, nothing more complicated than that, even as the feeling grew, evening by evening, into something considerably harder to keep so simply categorized. Elias's own fear, I came to understand much later, wore an older, more practical shape. He was 58 years old, 33 years my senior, and had spent 11 years since Agnes's death believing himself entirely finished with wanting anything beyond his shop and his solitude, filing away whatever affection had grown between us into the safest available category, a kind neighbor helping a struggling widow settle her land, and telling himself that category would hold, even as it grew steadily less convincing with every supper that appeared on his porch and every gate he found some new excuse to inspect. It was around this time that a formal, respectable widower named Harmon Betts, closer to my own age and newly arrived from Topeka with considerable prospects, began calling on me with an evident and entirely proper interest, bringing store-bought candy to my door and requesting the pleasure of driving me to the church social, a courtship the whole town watched with open approval, since by every sensible measure, a prosperous young widower represented precisely the match a struggling young homesteader ought to hope for. Mrs. Pruitt, delighted by the prospect, mentioned to anyone who would listen at the mercantile counter that a proper match had finally arrived for me, one that would spare me the whole hard business of managing land alone much longer. I want to pause the story here for just a moment, because this is exactly the point where a woman determined to prove her own independence has to reckon with watching the safer, more sensible choice arrive at her door with store-bought candy, while the man who had quietly rebuilt her gate before sunrise says nothing at all about his own evident feelings. I had spent weeks insisting to myself that I needed no one's help and wanted no particular man's attention. I was about to discover exactly how much that insistence cost me, watching it nearly hand my whole future to the wrong man simply because he was the one brave enough to ask. If you have been enjoying this story tonight, I would love to know whereabouts in the world you are listening from. whether that is somewhere here in the United States, up across the border in Canada, over in the United Kingdom or Australia, or anywhere else this old story happens to have found its way to. Do drop your country down in the comments below. It genuinely means a great deal to us to see how far these tales travel. Now, let us get back to Prairie Bend, because I am about to learn something about my own stubborn heart that Elias Corbin already seemed to understand. I accepted Harmon Betts's invitation to the church social, telling myself repeatedly that it was exactly the sensible choice a practical woman ought to make, and told myself this with such determined frequency that I very nearly believed it, right up until the evening itself, standing on my own porch, waiting for his carriage in a borrowed dress that felt, for reasons I could not immediately name, considerably less comfortable than my usual work clothes, when I found myself glancing, without quite meaning to, toward the lit window of Elias's shop, wondering whether he had noticed the dress at all or the particular care I had taken with my hair, and feeling, at the thought of his noticing, something considerably warmer than I had felt at any point during Harmon Betts's perfectly proper courtship. I said nothing of this to anyone, but driving home from that social, making polite conversation with a perfectly decent man I felt nothing whatsoever beyond polite regard for, I found myself turning over, with mounting discomfort, the plain fact that I had spent an entire evening wishing myself elsewhere, specifically in a quiet wheelwright shop with a man 33 years my senior, who had never once, in 3 months of quiet, unannounced kindness, asked me for anything beyond the simple pleasure of my belated thanks. I did not go to him that night, but 3 days later, having turned the whole matter over more times than I cared to admit, I found myself at his shop door regardless. No supper dish in hand this time, no gate to discuss, simply the plain, unadorned truth that I wanted to see him. I did not bring anything this time, I told him when he looked up from his workbench, faintly surprised to find me there without the usual covered dish. That is likely the first time you have come here without something wrapped in a cloth, he said, something careful beneath the familiar dry humor. Harmon Betts asked to call on me formally, I said, plain and direct. Whole town expects I will say yes eventually. And will you? He asked, though I suspected, watching him, that he already half knew my answer and was simply afraid of hearing it confirmed. No, I said, because I have spent 3 months telling myself I was only grateful for an unusually decent neighbor, and I have finally gotten tired of pretending that is the whole truth of it, Elias. I want to know what you meant, fixing my gate before sunrise without a single word, and then joking about your own age as though that joke were meant to end the conversation rather than simply postpone it. He set down his tools slowly, the whole small shop holding still around us, dust motes hanging suspended in the late afternoon light through his workshop window. I meant the joke as a kind of armor, he admitted, plain in a way I had not yet heard from him. 33 years is a great deal of arithmetic to ask a young woman to overlook, Tempe. I told myself fixing your gate and saying nothing further was the only decent shape my feelings were entitled to take. And now, I asked, quiet, steady, waiting. Now I am tired of the armor, he said. I am 58 years old, with more gray in my beard than not, and I have spent 11 years believing myself entirely finished with wanting anything beyond an honest day's work. And then, a stubborn young widow moved in next door and started proving me wrong about that, one crooked gate at a time. I do not need you to be anything other than exactly what you are, I said. I need you to stop calling yourself too old to be properly asked for. Is that permission? He asked, needing the plain word. It is considerably more than permission, I said, the smallest true smile finding my mouth. It is an answer to a question you have apparently been too stubborn to actually ask. Elias Corbin, 58 years old, and certain until roughly that very moment that his own feelings belonged strictly to the category of quiet, unspoken neighborly duty, crossed the small distance of his own workshop and kissed me. Careful at first, the way a man approaches anything he has spent 11 years convincing himself he no longer deserved, and then considerably less careful, while somewhere outside his shop, that same half-feral barn cat sat watching through the window with what I choose, even now, to remember as evident approval. Word moved through Prairie Bend with predictable speed once our engagement became official. Mrs. Pruitt declared she had suspected it since the lumber purchases began. Harmon Betts, to his credit, took the disappointment with considerably more grace than the town expected, admitting to Mrs. Pruitt that he had sensed these past weeks that my attention had settled somewhere he could not properly compete with, and old Ambrose Grubb claimed, with evident satisfaction, that he had known it the moment my mercantile account started running unnaturally light. We married the following spring, once the last hard frost had broken, in a small ceremony at the Prairie Bend Church with most of the town in attendance, because a community that had spent a whole winter watching a courtship unfold in fence repairs and covered suppers was not about to miss its conclusion. I wore light blue, having decided that a woman ought to be married in whatever color genuinely suited her rather than whatever tradition demanded, and Elias later told me I looked, standing at the front of that small church, exactly as striking as he had quietly believed. Since that first October morning, he found himself unable to leave my crooked gate standing one more night. His hands, steady enough shaping wood and iron for 4 decades, trembled slightly saying his vows, a fact I would tease him about gently for years afterward, and when it came his turn to speak beyond the standard words, he told me plainly that he had spent 11 years believing himself finished with wanting anything, and that I had proven, one quietly rebuilt gate at a time, that a man could be entirely wrong about his own careful arithmetic. Mrs. Pruitt, watching from the second pew, was overheard remarking afterward that she had never once in her years running the mercantile witnessed a courtship conducted so thoroughly through fence hinges and well pumps, and doubted she ever would again, a sentiment several other witnesses privately echoed as the whole small church erupted into the particular warm commotion that follows any wedding a community has watched unfold slowly, one quiet kindness at a time. Our first year together settled into a rhythm neither of us had fully expected, my own small homestead and his wheelwright shop combining into a single, more prosperous operation than either had managed separately, our combined land finally properly fenced and maintained the way I had always intended, but never quite managed alone. He built me a proper covered porch that first spring, sized and positioned exactly to catch the evening light I had once mentioned, only in passing, that I preferred while shelling peas because he had noticed without my mentioning it twice, precisely what I wanted, sketching the whole design himself on scraps of the same paper he used for wheel measurements. The old Ambrose Grubb took to remarking at the livery that the combined Corbin property had never looked so well maintained in the whole history of either homestead, a compliment Elias accepted with more grace than he had once shown toward any praise of his solitary work. It was not without its harder moments. That following winter, Elias's hands began troubling him with a stiffness that slowed his wheelwright work considerably, some mornings requiring a full hour of careful movement before the joints loosened enough for delicate work. A small, frightening preview of age finally beginning to claim what decades of hard labor had not, and I found myself, more than one long night, watching him work through simple tasks with visible difficulty and turning over a fear I had never quite let myself name fully, that I had married a man whose capable hands might, in time, ask more patience of me than I had originally accounted for. Elias, noticing my troubled quiet, did not brush past it. He told me plainly that his hands would likely trouble him further with the years, that he could not promise an easy road through every season ahead, but that he would always tell me the truth of how he was faring, rather than hide it out of some misguided notion of sparing my worry. And I, hearing him choose honesty over false comfort, found the fear easing into something I could carry rather than something that carried me. By the following spring, he had taken on a young apprentice specifically to handle the finer, more demanding work, a practical adjustment he made without complaint once I gently pointed out that stubborn hands rarely improved by being repeatedly tested against delicate wheelwright joinery. And I found, watching him train the young man patiently through his first difficult months, that Elias possessed a gentleness with beginners I had not fully witnessed until then, the same quiet noticing he had once shown my crooked gait now turned toward a nervous young apprentice's own halting, uncertain progress. 3 years passed, and on a bright October morning, almost exactly to the day since I had first discovered my gate rebuilt before sunrise, I stood at that same gate, still standing strong and true after all this time, The wood weathered now to a soft silver gray, but the hinge as sound as the morning he had set it. Our daughter Agnes Rose, coppery-haired like myself, balanced on my hip and reaching toward the road with delighted, fearless hands. That same half-feral barn cat, gray around the muzzle now and considerably more tolerant of human company than his younger self had ever permitted, wound once around my skirts before settling on the sun-warmed porch boards, exactly where he had claimed his spot years before. Elias came up from his shop for his midday coffee, boots dusty from the morning's work, and paused at the gate a long moment, running his hand along the same wood he had shaped that first sunrise years before, checking the hinge with the same careful professional eye he brought to every piece of work that passed through his hands, satisfied evidently to find it holding as true as the day he had built it. "This gate has held up better than I expected," he said, satisfaction plain in his voice. "It ought to," I said, smiling. "You built it exactly right the first time." He looked at me a long moment, our daughter babbling contentedly against my shoulder, the same barn cat winding once more around his boots. "You know," he said, "I still think about telling you not to thank a man twice your age, and I still think about thanking you anyway, decent neighbor or not," I said. "Best decision I ever made, letting you thank me," he said, and meant it entirely, in every sense a quiet man could mean such a thing. I want to stop here for just a moment before we close this story out, because I believe there is something in it worth sitting with tonight. We often assume that real love announces itself through bold declaration, through a man brave enough to simply ask for what he wants outright. But Elias Corbin's love for me announced itself first as a gate rebuilt in total silence before sunrise, a small, stubborn act of noticing what needed fixing before I had even properly asked for help, let alone for his heart. That is so often how the truest care actually arrives, not as declaration, but as quiet, consistent attention, as the plain decision to fix what is broken for somebody's sake without waiting to be thanked or even properly seen doing it. There is a particular kind of courage in loving somebody quietly for months, asking nothing, claiming nothing, simply doing the next useful thing and then disappearing before your own kindness could be properly witnessed. Elias never once tried to make his affection my responsibility to notice or reward. He simply kept showing up, gate by gate and supper by supper, until the pattern itself became impossible to keep mistaking for ordinary neighborliness. I had spent a whole year proving to myself that I needed no man's rescue, and I still believed that conviction was worth proving. But I learned, watching Elias Corbin work in near total silence for months before either of us said a single honest word about our feelings, that accepting quiet help freely given is not the same thing as needing rescue. It is simply allowing yourself to be properly seen and cared for by somebody patient enough to notice what you actually needed, long before you were ready to ask for it aloud. Sometimes, the truest romance is not a bold declaration, but an accumulation of small, unannounced kindnesses, each one a plank in a gate rebuilt so quietly you almost missed noticing who had done it. Thank you so much for spending this hour with me and with Elias tonight, wherever in this wide world you happen to be listening from. I would love to know down in the comments, were you rooting for Elias from that very first crooked gate, or did it take you a little longer, the way it took me myself, to trust that quiet kindness was the real thing? If this story kept you good company this evening, a like on this video and a subscribe to the channel mean a great deal to us and cost you nothing at all. And if you know someone who might need a quiet, gentle hour like this one, please do consider passing it along to them. Wherever you are tonight, I hope somebody notices exactly what needs fixing in your own life and fixes it quietly without ever needing to be asked. Until next time, keep writing.